Right, so today my search for transformational objects takes me to Makespace in Cambridge, where I am meeting with Mark Pinkerton, who is a risk systems specialist with Risilience here in Cambridge. Hello, Mark.
Good afternoon.
And I believe that you have got a transformational object that you would like to share with us for the library. Could you maybe say what it is and why you selected it for me?
Sure. So when I started thinking about this as a problem, so working both in, I suppose, the technology world, but also the intersection with the sort of risk world, it's actually quite hard to come up with an actual physical object that represents that. Like in the computing world, it's becoming, if anything, increasingly abstracted away. You know, when I started my career, we still had real servers and things like that. That's a total thing of the past. Even whiteboards are somewhat disappearing now. So the closest I could come up with for an actual physical object was a coffee cup, because much like mathematicians, software engineers very much run on caffeine as a fuel. And the one sort of constant through my whole career has been the ideation and sitting around and discussing things over a cup of coffee, often with people who are hugely obsessed with complicated coffee making rituals and sourcing beans, etc. But the other element of that is I thought there was a nice or an interesting aspect to that in terms of the risk work that I do. So earlier in my career, I did a lot of work trying to model catastrophes, so things like hurricanes and earthquakes, and build computer systems that allowed you to simulate those. More recently, I've moved into looking at climate risk and modeling how climate change and the societal and economic changes from that will impact companies. And why I thought the coffee cup was relevant to that is I think in sort of my own life, every morning, I think coffee is one of the things that I really think about is, often it comes from Brazil or Indonesia. It is these hugely complicated supply chains, which are at risk. I mean, our good friend, the Arabica bean is highly sensitive to, changes in temperature, to, economic changes around the world. So who knows what that will look like in, 10, 20 years.
Well, it is a great object to choose because in the context of transformation, as you say, there is that sense of firing up a brew and where do we get our ideas from? And as you say, in your work, as I understand it, it's very much information systems-based, digital computing. It's very much ideas. Mm-hmm. So it's not so much a physical object of transformation, but you somehow got to have that idea, that light bulb has got to go off somewhere, and coffee can often be a good way to kickstart that.
Oh, absolutely, yeah, definitely.
And I love the idea of the rituals around. Can you tell me about the mug that you've chosen? Is this your own? We've got in front of me. It's a rather lovely. It's a colourful one. It looks I'd almost say, I'm not a coffee cup expert, but it's got kind of dragons on it with faces blowing out a flower between them, maybe. Very, very pictorial.
It is. I mean, I dithered about, so we're currently at a well-known collaborative workspace in Cambridge that is very distinctive, branded coffee mugs. So from a day-to-day perspective, that might be more what's sort of burnt into my brain. But I thought instead I would bring one that's more of a personal favourite from home. It's I think it's a medieval Italian Deruta coffee cup. Not an original, obviously. But,
I was going to say.
But yeah, it's quite an attractive pattern that I've used for many years.
Absolutely, and with the idea of the kind of rituals, I was also thinking about it being a social thing. But the other thing is with tea and having a cup of tea. If we get stuck, it's often like a cliche. Well, let's put the kettle on and water cooler moments and that kind of sense of a communal enterprise. And it seems to be like this little opportunity for a little bonding moment, or maybe a chance to pause and to reflect. And maybe that's where the brain recharges its batteries from.
Yeah.
Although, funny enough, so I mean, conversely, apart from coffee being a stimulant, if you have a bit of a snooze and maybe a power nap, you can also get a good idea at the end of it.
Yeah.
Anyway,
I mean, it was certainly, previously working in the insurance industry, that was one of the, very much growing up in, I guess, the 17th century, and was sort of associated with the rise of the coffee house, and Lloyd's originally was a marketplace within a coffee shop. So to what extent there was that real correlation between, stopping drinking beer continuously and drinking coffee instead, with, suddenly coming up with all these interesting ideas.
Well, there's something. Well, I don't know the extent to which there is something in there, but you're absolutely right. Those early coffee houses were meant to be great levelers where people could come, exchange the ideas of the day. Kind of, people talk about them as laying some of the foundations for a democratic exchange of ideas
and information.
And information as well, and the latest news, and a real clearinghouse for ideas and information. Yes, absolutely. There's that link, and I was going to say. I assume from. Well, I'm not sure. Maybe I should. Whether I should assume in terms of your rituals. Whether you're a kind of a fresh coffee bean type person or an instant. Is that
No, I definitely take it quite seriously. So various
right.
types of fresh beans and apparatus for
you know your stuff.
Not quite. I mean, given we're working at Makespace, I definitely know people who've taken it. Started hacking their espresso machines to, customize the pressure, temperature gradients and things like that. I don't take it quite that far, but.
I blush to confess I'm generally satisfied with an instant coffee, and I was doing my homework. I thought that it was instant coffee was made as part of the kind of Apollo space mission, but that's a total urban myth.
Oh, really?
It was actually first done in about 1907 or something. So there we go. Right. Well, that's a little bit about coffee and its transformational qualities, maybe in terms of us and ideas. And I think there's a whole other conversation to be had about where ideas come from and how they spring to mind. But I'm glad that you brought up your own work and the ecological concerns and environmental concerns around it, because one of the things that I'm interested in for this podcast is our potential existential crisis that we might be heading for, and your work in assessing risk. Could you say a little bit more about that? You just mentioning that, and how maybe we can mitigate it, and some of the things that you're working on with Risilience as part of that.
Sure. I mean, as a company, and I think something that as a society we're increasingly interested in understanding and taking action about is obviously the looming climate catastrophe that we all know a lot about now and are starting to see the evidence of. But I think the sort of difficult thing is both, how do you measure a lot of this? How do you understand, what we can potentially do about it, and sort of both remain somewhat optimistic about it, but also chart a kind of sensible course. I mean, again, going back to the coffee cup, because one of the things I was looking at earlier was, as an example, like these things are really hard to measure. So I was looking at, what is the carbon output of a typical cup of coffee? And it's very dependent both on how sort of sustainably the coffee is manufactured, the supply chain it takes to get here, and then the other big variable is how milky you take it. Oat milk makes a huge difference from a carbon perspective. So I think the kind of full fat latte is actually maybe 600 grams of carbon, whereas a low fat or an oat milk sustainable cup of Joe might be 100 grams or something like that.
Wow, so a six-fold difference.
It's all the milk in that case.
Right.
But the weird thing for me, when I sort of did a quick back of the envelope calculation, is my carbon budget for coffee drinking is probably higher than that of driving, which is somewhat counterintuitive.
Wow.
Possibly because I drink a lot more coffee than, probably don't drive all that much. But, in terms of personal actions and computing, I think it sort of illustrates the complexity and maybe the sort of counterintuitive nature of some of
yes,
these...
and I think there's definitely a serious point to that, in that I think a lot of people who are not expert or maybe wanting to do the right thing, it's not always quite clear how to balance these different choices that we have. So I'm hoping that things are moving in the right direction, that companies are now starting to at least acknowledge these issues and trying to build their profiles around greener profiles and providing us with the information so we can make more informed choices.
I mean, starting to, it is, I think, incredibly complex. I mean, trying to trace back the sort of coffee sourcing, you're even spending, half an hour researching that in a bit more detail. It's very difficult to sort of get a clear picture of that. So doing it at more of a macro level or across, lots of different types of products is incredibly complex, and understanding the different trade-offs. But I think absolutely, companies are starting to take action around this, or you're seeing the changes in approach or the capturing of data, which is another important part of this, that will start facilitating some of this, the decision making.
So you're dealing with risk and dealing at the coalface of many of these problems. How do you manage to keep your head above the water? Because sometimes it can feel as though things are quite difficult at the moment in so many different ways, and with the news that comes out with climate and things like that. Do you find it easy to kind of disconnect from it, or do you have an approach to risk in your own life that helps you to keep things in perspective a little bit, maybe?
I mean, I think there's a couple of aspects to that. The first is, I think I do struggle more with the sort of risk I'm looking at now compared to something like hurricane risk. I could very much get my head around that. There was there was data, there's good physics behind it. Even though there was uncertainty and complexity in it, it still felt somewhat more tractable. Whereas there's so many additional variables with say climate and how it's not just climate, it connects to sort of natural capital and more general environment, and there's the whole social, how do consumers respond to it, how do laws change, it is a bit head spinning. And I think the other aspect is generally people are really bad at kind of the temporal aspect of risk, both signals that change in a less immediate sense, things that are changing over 10, 20, 30 years, even if there's very good evidence for it, it's hard to take action on that. Even as I think someone fairly well informed about this and well aware of the risk, and trying to do the right things most of the time, I still probably don't take it half as seriously as I should do. And I'm not sure, it's interesting how you change that. There's studies that even how you talk about it and the sort of language you use about future tenses can be quite material to how people can make decisions.
Yes, I think that's right. And I mean, again, going back to this project, it's at least trying to have a conversation around, well, can we do things differently, or what can we learn from objects or things in the past? And one of the things, is just that awareness, and hopefully that everybody then incrementally does their bit, and things gradually change, and our habits change, and our understandings change. But these things do all take time, and that can be difficult. And I know also that I think you said that to me before that you do a little bit of climbing. Climbing seems to me superficially to be quite a risky thing, but presumably it's much safer than it might appear.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, and I don't know whether it's coincident or not, but I know I have come across quite a lot of people in the sort of risk industry who have been into climbing, and I think in some ways you can think of it as applied risk management, because it's the risk is pretty in your face when you're halfway up a cliff and you can see the knot to the little piece of metal that's standing between you and oblivion. But against that, it is very considered. I think the climbing that most people do is relatively safe if you've thought about and chosen to accept the risks that are there and manage the ones that you can. It is pretty safe.
nevertheless, yeah, sometimes I'm not sure I would go for the adrenaline hit of being halfway up a mountainside. But, well, yeah, are you an adrenaline junkie, would you say, or is it just that kind of just that sense of adventure? I mean,
no, not particularly. I mean, again, I think that the sort of risk management side probably precludes the adrenaline would be the proper risky sort of, that's the stuff you can't manage. I probably have less interest in.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your coffee cup, which we might induct into the library for the duration of this project, if that's all right.
Yeah, absolutely.
And by way of conclusion, I suppose, thinking about risk, I mean, and the perils. Well, it's difficult. We don't make it too scary, or else people just think that nothing can be done. And I do think there are possibilities for action still, and everybody can start to turn the boat around, and hopefully we will we will get there.
It's time to fire up the espresso machine and caffeinate ourselves ready for action, because there is a lot to be done to tackle this big challenge.
Yeah, so maybe we need to metaphorically fire up the coffee machine and have an all-nighter on this one and see if we can crack it. Well, thank you so much for this conversation. It's been fascinating.
Pleasure.
Thank you.